So our first speaker this morning is Claudia Theune. She studies prehistory and early medieval archaeology at the universities of Marburg and Bonn. Since 2007, she's been Professor of Historical Archaeology at the University of Vienna. Her research interests include archaeology of the Middle Ages and modern times, especially early medieval forms of representation, medieval ways of life in remote areas, and particularly the Alps, and the contemporary archaeology in former Nazi forced labour camps. And she's going to be talking to us this morning about infrastructure, archaeology, and medieval rural settlement in Austria. So thank you very much, Claudia. The stage is yours.
So thank you, Karenza, for the kind introduction. And as Karenza said, I'm employed at the University of Vienna as Professor of Historical Archaeology. All excavations, also in the context of infrastructural projects and archaeology in the medieval rural environment, are administrated by the Federal Monuments Authority as a state authority. Thus, for this lecture, I have been cooperated with the deputy head of the Federal Monuments Authority, Eva Steckberger. I will first give an introduction regarding the general framework in Austria, then present some examples, and I will discuss sites of the early medieval ages, focusing on medieval and late medieval deserted settlements, but I will also talk briefly about post-medieval structures. Another important point in my presentation is the Alpine region, as a large part of Austria belongs to the high Alpine zone. So therefore, it is important to have a first look at the topography of the country. Austria is a small country with about 84,000 square kilometers, with a west-east extension from Lake Neusiedl in the east and Lake Constance in the west of almost 600 kilometers. The northern-south extension, however, is small, partly less than 100 kilometers. Austria lays in the Alps, like you can see, and it's about 2/3 of the country in this Alpine zone, and this means that all these areas must be considered as marginal or remote. Only 2/3 of Austria's land areas lies lower than 500 meters above sea level, but 56% of the population lives in areas below 400 meters, and only 6% live in the real high altitude above 800 meters. So the most people live in the lowlands. But the most part of the countries are an Alpine zone. Overall, Austria is rural, not only in the Alpine regions, but also in the foothills of the Alps or in the lowland. A part of the capital, Vienna, in the east of the country, with about 2 million inhabitants, there are only a few larger cities like Graz, Linz, Salzburg, or Innsbruck. The foothills of the Alps in the lowlands, in particular in the eastern part of Austria, you can see in the slide on the left-hand side, are mostly free of forest. In the open land, agriculture and livestock breeding can be practiced. However, here in Lower Austria, 37% of all known archaeological sites are located in the east. To understand the situation regarding archaeology in general in Austria, the organization of archaeology should be briefly explained. The Federal Monuments Authority, Bundesdenkmalamt, BDA, is responsible for the archaeological supervision in the 9 federal states of Austria. In addition to a central office in the capital, Vienna, there are regional offices in all federal states, where usually only one archaeologist is employed. Only in the densely populated regions in the eastern part, there are 2 trained archaeologists. In some cities, there are also city archaeologists, as we say. It is obvious that the excavations themselves cannot carry it out by the BDI itself, but it is carried out by commercial archaeological companies in which archaeologists, but also anthropologists or even conservators work. The BDI compiles an archaeological inventory. The aim is a compilation of the archaeological monument register and the GIS-based mapping of all known archaeological sites. These sites are now no longer mapped as a point on the maps, as you can see above on the left-hand side, but plotted with precision. This facilitates a better planning for all stakeholders involved in large-scale infrastructural projects. This data is incorporated in public data and maps of the surveying offices. Apart from the larger infrastructure projects that have to undergo an environmental impact assessment, and for which the BDR is called in ex officio, it can happen that infrastructure projects which are not automatically reported to the BDA take place without knowing by the authority and be destroyed without archaeological excavation. This can be seen as a threat to archaeological remains in the rural area. The excavations are financed by the CORSA, cost by cost principle, as it is probably the case in some other countries. In the case of infrastructure projects, for example, the large companies and institutions pay for the excavation, but usually only for the excavation and the first conservation treatments of the find and the writing of a report for the BDA. Sometimes a small popular brochure, as you can see here, is also financed. So there are a lot of excavations which produce a lot of finds and an infinitive amount of archaeological data, but can hardly be analyzed in a medium term unless such obligations have been defined in the environmental impact assessment decisions. Also a threat in terms of knowledge of archaeological structures. In some cases, archaeological complexes can be analyzed at the universities in master thesis or through external funding. A last point, the BDA has been issuing so-called guidelines for archaeological interventions, also in English, as you can see, for about 13 years, which are reviewed and modified regularly. All excavations in Austria have to follow these guidelines. A report on the excavation is published in the Fundberichte aus Österreich. A longer, more detailed report is published digitally and is generally accessible. Included in the entire documentation are the database of the find, the photo documentation, maps and plans, as well as the concepts of further conservation and the storage of the find. This ensures that the method of excavation itself and total documentation are always the same and thus comparable. It can be stated that the quality of the excavation and the documentation have improved since the implementation of these guidelines. However, Austria has an immense land consumption and a very large ongoing sealing of the soil surface, which in many cases is related to large infrastructure projects. The sealing of the soil surface currently amounts between 15 and 25 hectares per day in Austria. This land consumption is especially high in the eastern part of the country. This is also where most excavation takes place. The BDR issues about 700 permits per excavation. For excavations per year, about 1/3 take place in the eastern part. Sealing of the soil surface primarily affects the outskirts of the villages and towns in order to build commercial areas, and sealing of the soil surface affects agriculture areas when roads and motorways are built, when the railway network is extended, and when, for example, wind farms are built also in the high mountains. And there is already an important point to make. Infrastructural projects have to be mentioned due to the development in the Alps for tourism, especially in the ski resorts. It is accompanied by immense loss of still or less existing natural spaces and the medieval landscape. The sealing of the soil surface is certainly a threat to the medieval rural landscape. The archaeological research on medieval settlements is conducted since the middle of the 20th century. Over 2,000 deserted settlements have been recorded in the eastern part of Austria through countless surveys in rural areas. In a database, the so-called Wüstungsarchiv, The size, chronology, the important written and archaeological data are mentioned, as well as toponyms, characteristic shirts, maps, historical maps, aerial photographs, and so on. A project is currently being initiated to digitize this database and make it accessible for the public. Hardly any medieval settlements have been comprehensively excavated. Still, the central reference point for a completely excavated settlement is a deserted village of Hart, north of Vienna, which has been excavated in the 70s. It is a dead-end village. At the northern end is a representative manor house. The quality of the finds from the manor house stand out clearly from that of other farmsteads. Further fully recordable rural settlement can then only be cited for one already older military infrastructure project. The Allensteig military training area was built by the National Socialists in 1938. 42 villages with about 7,000 inhabitants were resettled. The area covers over 160 square kilometers. Several parts of these villages are still more or less standing, albeit in ruins, not least because the buildings were considered as targets for shooting practice in the past, not now, but in the past. A recent small project dealt with the development of the post-medieval settlement structures and the question of the development of villages structures from the Middle Ages to the modern time. 4 villages were studied. Of importance was the role of winter stabling through the construction of stables and barns and the development of multi-winged farmsteads. In addition, a social differentiation of the village community through farmsteads in the narrow sense and small houses in the outskirts of the settlement could be recognized. In addition, the change of some facades on the front side, as well as the additions of stories and new windows, was observed, possibly an urban element in the villages from the late 18th century onwards. The main excavations of linear infrastructure projects are located in the greater area of Vienna, often motorway construction, as you can see here. Existing villages are considered in the planning of the routes and are not touched or devastated. Only structures under the surface are excavated and recorded, including deserted villages. As it is the case everywhere, only parts of the sites are documented. The archaeological excavations ends at the route boundaries. An example for an early medieval burial ground from the Avar period is a cemetery near Vösendorf, south of Vienna. A total of more than 600 burials were excavated, including burials to which a horse was added, as you can see on the left-hand side. Early medieval settlements are quite rare. In the course of the construction of northern motorway connecting Vienna with the Czech Republic, the early medieval settlement of Pellendorf was excavated. Basically, it is a multi-period site with an area about 20,000 square meters. A particular high density of finds was found from the 7th to the 10th century. About 130 features, including several complete or almost completely preserved houses, numerous deep storage pits, and some oven features were documented. The site is one of the largest rural settlements in the early Middle Ages in Lower Austria known so far. 3 phases can be distinguished. The pottery of the early phases show close relation to the Great Moravian area, now Czech territory. In the last phase, the first Western influences can be detected by graffiti pottery. Archaeobotanical and archaeozoological material can draw attention to the economy and environmental conditions in this border region. The settlement of Pellendorf is one of the few that has been comprehensively analyzed and also published. Several deserted settlements from the high and late medieval ages were discovered during the construction of the Vienna's eastern bypass, the so-called S1. The details of deserted villages can still be seen on the maps of the 19th century, as you can see on the left. Due to an intensive agriculture in the last century, intensive agriculture in the last century, the former medieval level has no longer preserved and only deepened objects could be documented. One must therefore be aware of a great loss of medieval structures due to agriculture economy in the modern age. The deserted village of Atzesdorf was excavated in 2006. Here, some of the findings are of interest for new insights into medieval deserted settlements. On the basis of specific features, it was possible to establish boundaries between the properties and thus recorded 3 house parcels. Also of importance is a ditch running north to south, which bounded the village and offered protection. Such villages and closures have been rarely excavated in Austria. Some are known from aerial photographs. There's hardly any evidence in these villages for rural craft. Examples of excavation of rural settlements in the course of infrastructure projects in the context of settlement extension can be seen in Breitenfeld, north of Vienna. The Breitenfeld deserted settlement belonged to the late medieval ages. The structures of the settlement were already known from that aerial photograph, what you see. And it is probably a village around a village green. 2 lines run parallel to the rows of the houses, probably also a surrounding ditch. In addition, a so-called Erdstall on the right-hand side, a souterrain gallery was found in the settlement, which are numerous in Austria. A souterrain gallery is an artificial created cave, which usually has an entrance near the house. The ground plane of such souterrain gallery can be a wide variety of forms. Often there is an irregular layout, narrow and low passages, cross sections, small chambers, and sometimes circular walkways. A conclusive interpretation of these structures has not yet been achieved. However, I would like now to add tourism infrastructure projects, especially related with winter sports in the ski resort. As mentioned at the beginning, 2/3 of the country belong to the high Alpine region. We know that the Alps were already regularly crossed and economically used in the Bronze Age. Cows, sheep, and goats had been kept in dairy projects produced on the snow-free summer pastures since the Bronze Age and also in the Middle Ages during the post-medieval Little Ice Age. You see the rests of the huts. A second important point is the use of the Alps must be mentioned. Central regions of the high Alps in the town have enormous natural resources such as salt, copper, gold, and silver. Many of these deposits have been known since the prehistoric times and developed and mined. Gold mining, in particular, as you can see on the right-hand side, is intensively practiced in the Middle Ages. Underground mining took place in the winter as well as the summer, and there is always a uniform temperature of 8 degrees Celsius in the mountains. However, in winter, when there is snow, transport by sledges is much easier than in summer with packed animals. And a third point must be mentioned. I have said that the Alps have always been crossed. Numerous paths led through the Alps connecting the northern Alpine region with Italy. In the Middle Ages, these paths were used by numerous traders for the important trade with Venice or by pilgrims on their way to Rome. For these people, guest houses next to the top of the path were built where people could take a rest. And you can see on the left hand down a medieval path on the Zolk path. Since the 70s, more and more ski resorts have been developed and many ski slopes have been built in the Alpine region. The landscape is significantly changed by the construction of the ski slopes, as can be clearly seen here in the example of Obertauern on the left-hand side from 64 and the right-hand side from 2020, a picture of the same regions, and you see all the slopes on the opposite of the mountains, and you see how many slopes there are on that map. Or you can see it here in the Montafon. In addition, in recent years, due to the climate change, artificial lakes have been created in which water is stored for artificial snowmaking in the winter, as you can see on the right-hand side above. Original topographical characteristics in such massively reshaped mountain regions can only be recognized from old maps and old photographs. And you see on the left-hand side, there are 10 years between these photographs, and you see the massive change. In contrast to the aforementioned major roads or railway construction projects, there are hardly any environmental impact assessments and therefore no archaeological excavation to a desirable extent. Only surveys or some research excavation, as I did it also in the Alps, provide information, but the diverse and provide information about the diverse use of the Alps in the Middle Ages. To come to a conclusion, a wide variety of medieval settlements are affected by large infrastructure projects. Usually, the former structures are documented by excavations related to the infrastructure projects. A comprehensive documentation has increased the quality of the excavation and the documentation. The report of the most important results is published in the Fundberichte Österreichs. However, detailed analysis and publication cannot be guaranteed. As described, there are some new insights in the medieval settlement, but comprehensive analyses are rare. This applies, for example, the question regarding the beginning of the villages, the late medieval inner villages structures, parcellation, the question of markets, trades, and workshops, the network itself of medieval settlement. Overall, there is a massive impact on historical cultural landscape due to the immensely high level of sealing of the soil surface, which affects major changes on the landscape and the rural landscape in Austria. In addition, in recent years, there has been another threat affecting archaeological sites, the climate change. Thank you for your attention.